There's nothing quite like the regret of missing your mother's final goodbye. In 1883, Josiah Crane faced the hardest choice a son could make: work to survive the winter, or be there when his mother passed. He chose work. By the time he returned from the mountains, the funeral was over. All he had left was an old photograph and a heart full of sorrow. But then something beautiful happened. Catherine Ashworth, a wealthy widow from the East, heard about this mountain man's pain. What she did next shocked everyone in town and changed both their lives forever. What could possibly compel a woman of high society to risk her reputation for a stranger's grief? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind carved through the Montana mountains like a blade, carrying with it the promise of another brutal winter. Josiah Crane stood at the edge of his timber porch, watching the last amber light fade behind the western peaks. His weathered hands gripped a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold, but he held it anyway, partly for warmth, mostly for the comfort of routine. The cabin behind him was modest by any measure, built from logs he'd cut himself 23 years ago when he first came to these mountains. It sat in a natural clearing, surrounded by towering pines that whispered secrets to the wind. The structure was solid, crafted with the patience of a man who understood that in this country your shelter meant the difference between life and death. Every chink was carefully sealed, every board fitted with precision. The stone chimney rose straight and true, smoke drifting lazily into the evening sky. Inside, the single room held everything a man needed and nothing he didn't. A pot-bellied stove dominated the center, radiating warmth throughout the space. His bed occupied one corner, covered with quilts his mother had made each stitch a prayer for his safety in this remote place. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs sat near the window, though the second chair hadn't held a visitor in months. Shelves lined the walls, holding books worn smooth from reading, supplies carefully rationed for the season ahead, and a few precious mementos from a life lived simply but with purpose. The most treasured item in the cabin sat on the mantel above the stove, a photograph of his mother, Anna Crane, taken the year before he'd left for the mountains. Her eyes held the same gentle strength that had carried their family through his father's death, through years of hardship that would have broken lesser souls. She wore her Sunday dress in the picture, her grey hair pinned back with the silver comb he'd bought her for Christmas. Even captured in sepia tones, her warmth seemed to fill the room. Josiah had built this life deliberately, choosing solitude over the complications of town living. After his father died in the railroad accident 15 years ago, he'd stayed close to home, working local jobs to help his mother manage. But the mountains called to him not from wanderlust, but from necessity. A man could earn good money working the railroad crews that pushed through these peaks, money that could keep a small family afloat when other work ran dry. The irony wasn't lost on him that the very rails his father died building had become Josiah's salvation. He'd started working the mountain lines 8 years ago, learning to read the weather, to anticipate the dangers, to work with crews of men who understood that up here, you looked after each other or you didn't come home. His reputation had grown among the railroad bosses. Josiah Crane was reliable, strong as an ox, and afraid of nothing the mountains could throw at him. His tools sat by the door, ready for tomorrow's uncertain work. The pickaxe bore the scars of countless strikes against stone and frozen earth. Its handle was worn smooth by his calloused hands, darkened with sweat and weather. The hammer felt balanced and true, an extension of his arm after years of use. These tools had built rail lines through passes where other men wouldn't venture, had carved civilization's path through wilderness that wanted to remain wild. But tonight, those tools felt heavier than usual. Word had come down from the rail office in Millerville, one more job before winter set in hard. Good money, the kind that would see him through until spring. The only problem was timing. His mother's cough had worsened over the past month, and Doc Richardson had been visiting more frequently, wearing the expression that medical men got when they carried news too heavy for words. The town of Millerville lay 15 miles down the mountain, connected to Josiah's cabin by a trail he could walk blindfolded. It wasn't much of a town, maybe 300 souls when the weather was good and the railroad crews were working. A main street lined with weathered buildings, a church with a bell that rang every Sunday, a general store that doubled as the post office, and Sally's boarding house where travelers could get a hot meal and a clean bed. His mother lived in a small house near the church, the same house where Josiah had been born 34 years ago. She'd raised him there after his father died, taking in sewing and washing to make ends meet, never once complaining about the hand life had dealt her. Anna Crane possessed the kind of strength that came from faith, not the showy kind that needed an audience, but the quiet certainty that sunrise would follow, sunset, that kindness mattered more than wealth, and that love could sustain a person through anything. She'd been proud when Josiah found steady work with the railroad, even though it meant long absences. "You do what you must, son," she'd told him. "I raised you to be a man who keeps his word and pays his debts. The good Lord will take care of the rest." Those words had carried him through storms and avalanches, through nights when the cold bit so deep it felt like death itself. The other railroad men respected Josiah for his work ethic and his character. Foreman Murphy, a grizzled Irishman who'd been laying track since before Josiah was born, often said that Crane was worth 3 ordinary men. "That mountain man don't know the meaning of quit," Murphy would tell new crews. "You stick close to him, and you'll come home with all your fingers and toes." But it wasn't just his physical capabilities that earned respect. Josiah had a way of calming tensions when crews got restless, of finding solutions when problems seemed insurmountable. He'd once convinced a crew to work through a blizzard by rigging windbreaks that saved the project, and probably several lives. When young Eddie Morrison fell into a ravine and broke his leg, Josiah had fashioned a sled and pulled him 5 miles to safety, working through a night that tested every ounce of his endurance. These mountains had taught him patience and humility. You couldn't rush nature or force your will upon stone and ice. You learned to work with the land, to read its moods, to respect its power. The men who survived up here understood that civilization was a thin veneer, easily stripped away by wind and cold and the raw indifference of the peaks. Now, as October's chill settled into the valley, Josiah faced a decision that would test everything he believed about duty and love. The railroad job would take him into the high country for at least 3 weeks, maybe longer if weather turned bad. The money was substantial enough to stock his cabin for winter and help his mother with her medical expenses. Doc Richardson's visits weren't free, and neither were the medicines he'd been prescribing, but his mother's cough worried him. It had started as a minor irritation in late summer, the kind of thing that usually cleared up with rest and honey tea. Instead, it had grown worse, settling deep in her chest where it rattled like autumn leaves. She tried to hide it from him during his visits, but he could see the weariness in her eyes, the way she gripped the back of her chair when the coughing fits came. "It's nothing but a stubborn cold," she insisted whenever he brought it up. "You worry too much, Josiah. I've weathered worse storms than this." But Anna Crane had never been a convincing liar, and her son could read the truth in her face. This wasn't just a cold, and they both knew it. The railroad offer had come at the worst possible time. Foreman Murphy himself had ridden up to the cabin, hat in hand, asking if Josiah could handle one last push before the snows closed the high passes. "There's a section of track needs finishing before winter," Murphy explained. "Dangerous work, but you're the only man I trust to see it through. Companies offering triple wages." Triple wages. The words echoed in Josiah's mind as he watched darkness claim the mountains. That money could change everything, could pay for the best doctors, could ensure his mother's comfort through what might be a long, difficult recovery. But taking the job meant leaving her when she needed him most, meant gambling that 3 weeks wouldn't be too long. He'd prayed about it, kneeling beside his bed the way his mother had taught him. but no clear answer came. Sometimes faith meant trusting in providence, but sometimes it meant making impossible choices with an imperfect heart. As the wind picked up and the first stars appeared between the clouds, Josiah Crane prepared to make the hardest decision of his life. The photograph on the mantel seemed to watch him in the flickering firelight, his mother's gentle smile offering neither approval nor condemnation, only the patient love that had sustained him all his years. Tomorrow he would have to choose between the work that defined him and the woman who made him. Tonight, he could only sit with the weight of that choice and listen to the mountains whisper their ancient, indifferent songs. The decision came to Josiah at dawn, carried on the wings of necessity rather than desire. He'd spent the night wrestling with his conscience, but when morning light touched the peaks and he counted the dwindling supplies in his cabin, the mathematics of survival made his choice clear. 3 weeks of work would mean months of security for both him and his mother. He would take the railroad job. The ride down to Millerville felt longer than usual, his horse picking its way carefully along the frost-slicked trail. Each turn brought him closer to a conversation he dreaded, yet he found himself urging the mare forward rather than delaying the inevitable. Anna Crane deserved honesty, even when the truth would hurt them both. He found his mother in her kitchen, preparing breakfast with the methodical care she brought to everything. Her movements were slower than he remembered, and that persistent cough interrupted her work every few minutes. When she saw him through the window, her face lit up with the joy that always greeted his unexpected visits. "Josiah, what brings you down so early?" She wiped her hands on her apron and embraced him, and he felt how thin she'd become beneath the layers of wool and cotton. "Sit yourself down. I'll fix you some eggs and biscuits. Ma, we need to talk." The words came out heavier than he intended, and he saw worry flicker across her features. They sat at the small table where he'd eaten countless meals as a boy, where she'd helped him with his letters, where they'd planned his future together after his father died. He explained the job offer, watching her face carefully as he spoke. She listened without interruption, her weathered hands folded in her lap, her eyes never leaving his face. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting to the window where morning light painted the world in shades of gold and amber. "How long?" she asked finally. 3 weeks, maybe 4 if the weather turns bad." She nodded slowly, and he could see her weighing his words against the realities they both understood. Money was scarce, winter was coming, and opportunities like this didn't present themselves often in their corner of the territory. "The money's good?" she asked. "Very good. Enough to see us both through winter, with plenty to spare." Anna Crane had raised her son to be honest, and she'd learned to recognize truth in his voice. She also knew him well enough to understand that he'd already made his decision, that he was seeking her blessing rather than her permission. "Then you should go," she said, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "We've weathered separations before, son. 3 weeks isn't forever." But even as she spoke the words, that deep cough seized her, bending her forward with its force. When the fit passed, she straightened with obvious effort, dabbing at her mouth with a handkerchief. Josiah caught a glimpse of something dark on the white fabric before she tucked it away. "Ma, are you sure about this? I could stay, find work closer to home." "Nonsense." Her voice carried the authority that had guided him through childhood. "You've got a reputation to maintain, and Murphy's counting on you. Besides, Doc Richardson says this cough will clear up once the weather stabilizes. Just needs time and rest." She stood and moved to her dresser, returning with a letter already sealed and addressed. "I was planning to send this with the next post, but since you're here," she pressed it into his hands. "For when you get lonely up there in those mountains." The letter felt substantial in his palm, more than a simple note. "What's in it?" "Just some thoughts from an old woman to her son. Read it when you need reminding of how proud I am of you." Her smile was gentle but firm. "Now, you'd better get moving if you want to catch Murphy before he heads out." The farewell was harder than either of them expected. Anna held him longer than usual, and he felt her shoulders shake slightly against his chest. "You be careful up there," she whispered. "Promise me you'll come home." "I promise, Ma. 3 weeks, maybe less." "I'll be here waiting," she said, stepping back and straightening her shoulders. "I'll be here." The journey to the high country took 2 days of hard riding through terrain that grew more challenging with each mile. Josiah joined Murphy's crew at the base camp, a collection of rough shelters and supply tents positioned near the unfinished rail line. The work was exactly as advertised: dangerous, demanding, and essential. They were pushing track through Devil's Pass, a route that would save the railroad months of construction time if they could complete it before the heavy snows arrived. The crew was smaller than usual, composed entirely of men Murphy trusted with his life. Besides Josiah, there was Red Sullivan, a giant of a man whose strength was matched only by his gentle nature. Tom Bradley, a demolitions expert who could place charges with surgical precision, and young Pete Morrison, Eddie's brother, who worked twice as hard as anyone to prove himself worthy of the crew. The work consumed their days from dawn to dusk. They blasted through granite walls, laid track across spans that dropped into seeming nothingness, and battled weather that changed without warning. The high altitude made every task more difficult, but the crew pressed on with the determination of men who understood the stakes. Josiah threw himself into the labor with characteristic intensity, partly to earn his wages and partly to quiet the nagging worry about his mother. He told himself that 3 weeks would pass quickly, that she was stronger than her recent frailty suggested, that Doc Richardson would take good care of her. But deep in his heart, a voice whispered warnings he tried not to hear. 2 weeks into the job, the first major storm hit. It came without warning, a wall of snow and wind that turned day into night and made work impossible. The crew huddled in their shelters, playing cards and telling stories while nature raged outside. When the storm finally passed 3 days later, they emerged to find the world transformed, white and silent and beautiful in its deadly perfection. "We push through," Murphy announced as they surveyed the changed landscape. "Company wants this section finished, and we've got maybe a week before the next big one hits." They worked with desperate efficiency, knowing that each day brought them closer to the point where the weather would make further progress impossible. Josiah's hands bled inside his gloves, his back ached from the constant bending and lifting, but he kept working. Every spike driven was money in his pocket, security for his mother, justification for his absence. It was on the 18th day that young Pete Morrison came running into camp, his face pale with more than cold. He'd ridden down to the nearest telegraph office to send Murphy's weekly report, and he carried news that hit Josiah like a physical blow. "Message for you, Crane," Pete said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Came through this morning." The telegram was brief, the words stark against the yellow paper. Anna Crane passed peacefully. October 22nd, stop funeral. October 24th, stop. Sorry for your loss. Stop, Dr. Richardson. Josiah stared at the paper, reading the words again and again, as if repetition might change their meaning. October 22nd, 3 days ago. The funeral tomorrow. He looked up at the mountains surrounding their camp, calculating distances and travel time with the desperate precision of a man watching his world collapse. "Murphy," he called, his voice strange and hollow. The foreman looked up from the rail section he was inspecting, saw Josiah's face, and understood immediately that something fundamental had changed. "Go," Murphy said before Josiah could speak. "Take Morrison's horse. He's the fastest. Ride hard and maybe you can still make it." But even as Josiah threw his few belongings into a pack, even as he swung up onto the borrowed horse and pointed its nose toward home, he knew the truth. The mountains that had given him work and purpose had also stolen from him the one thing that mattered most. By the time he reached Millerville, the funeral would be over, the mourners dispersed, and his mother would be resting in ground that had frozen hard enough to make digging a struggle. The last letter she'd given him remained unopened in his pack, her final words waiting to be read by a son who had chosen work over love and would live with that choice for the rest of his days. As his horse carried him down the treacherous trail toward a home that would never feel the same, Josiah Crane learned that some decisions echo through a man's life, like thunder through the mountains, impossible to take back, impossible to forget. The ride down from Devil's Pass became a blur of desperate urgency and crushing realization. Josiah pushed Morrison's horse harder than he should have, driven by the futile hope that somehow the telegram had been wrong, that there was still time to reach his mother's side. But with each mile that passed beneath the horse's hooves, the mathematics of distance and time told him what his heart refused to accept. He arrived in Millerville as the sun was setting on October 24th, the very day his mother was laid to rest. The horse was lathered and trembling from the punishing ride, but Josiah barely noticed. He dismounted outside his mother's house and stood for a moment in the gathering dusk, looking at windows that would never again glow with her lamplight. The door was unlocked, it always had been, a testament to the trust that existed in their small community. Inside, everything appeared exactly as he remembered from his last visit, yet the absence of life transformed the familiar space into something foreign and hollow. Her coffee cup still sat on the kitchen table, her reading glasses folded beside the Bible she'd been studying. The silence felt oppressive, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock that continued its faithful count of moments his mother would never see. Doc Richardson found him there an hour later, sitting at the kitchen table and staring at his mother's empty chair. The doctor knocked softly and entered when Josiah didn't respond, his medical bag in one hand and his hat in the other. "Josiah," Doc Richardson said gently, "I'm sorry you didn't make it in time. Tell me what happened." Josiah's voice sounded foreign to his own ears, flat and lifeless. Doc Richardson took the chair across from him, the same chair where Anna had sat countless times while the doctor examined Josiah's childhood scrapes and fevers. Her lungs gave out. It happened quickly, she didn't suffer. Father Miguel was with her at the end. When? Tuesday morning, just after sunrise. She was sitting right here, working on some sewing. Just closed her eyes and was gone. The doctor paused, studying Josiah's face. She talked about you constantly, worried that you'd blame yourself for taking that job. The funeral. Today, at 2 o'clock. Good turnout, your mother was well loved in this town. We waited as long as we could, but... Doc Richardson gestured helplessly. October ground freezes fast up here. We couldn't wait any longer. Josiah nodded, understanding the practicalities even as they cut deep. Where? Church cemetery, next to your father. Father Miguel said some beautiful words about her faith and devotion. The whole town was there, Josiah. She wasn't forgotten. After Doc Richardson left, Josiah walked through the house like a man in a dream. He found his mother's mourning dress hanging in her wardrobe, the black wool dress she'd worn to his father's funeral and every Memorial Day since. She'd had it cleaned and pressed, waiting for the occasion when she would need it for her own departure. The sight of it hanging there, prepared and patient, broke something inside him that hadn't broken during the long ride home. Among her belongings, he discovered evidence of the preparations she'd made. A neat stack of papers on her dresser contained her will, written in her careful handwriting and witnessed by Father Miguel and Doc Richardson. She'd left everything to Josiah, along with detailed instructions for her burial and a list of debts to be settled. Even in death, Anna Crane was taking care of others. The will included a note, "Josiah, do not carry guilt for doing what was right. You are a good son, and I am proud of the man you've become. Live well, and remember that love doesn't end with death. Your mother." That evening, Father Miguel visited, bringing with him a kindness that had comforted the grieving for 30 years in Millerville. The priest was a small man with prematurely grey hair and eyes that had seen both the best and worst of human nature. "She spoke of you often," Father Miguel said as they sat in Anna's parlor. "Even at the end, she was worried about your safety in those mountains. I told her that God watches over dutiful sons, and she seemed comforted by that. I should have been here. She understood why you weren't. Your mother was proud of your work ethic, Josiah. She knew you took that job to provide for her, not to avoid her. Father Miguel stayed for an hour, sharing memories of Anna's quiet charity and steady faith. She'd helped countless families through difficult times, often cooking meals for the sick or watching children when parents needed to work. Her death had left a hole in the community that would be difficult to fill. The next morning, Josiah made his way to the cemetery. The church sat on a small hill overlooking the town, its white steeple pointing hopefully toward heaven. The cemetery occupied the slope behind the building, marked with simple headstones that told the stories of lives lived and lost in this remote corner of the territory. He found his parents' graves easily, 2 mounds of fresh earth beside an older, settled grave, marked with a simple wooden cross bearing his father's name. The new headstone for his mother was temporary, a wooden marker that would be replaced with carved stone when the stonemason could complete the work. Standing there in the morning light, Josiah tried to find words for the conversation he'd never had. He'd imagined this moment differently himself, beside her bed, holding her hand, speaking the gratitude and love that had lived in his heart for 34 years. Instead, he faced a mound of dirt and the terrible finality of silence. "I'm sorry, Ma," he whispered. "I thought I was doing right by us both." The wind stirred the dying leaves of the oak tree that shaded the graves, the only response to his words. Around him, the cemetery held the quiet dignity of a place where sorrow came to rest. Other families had faced similar losses, made similar choices, carried similar regrets. But knowledge of shared suffering provided little comfort to a son who would never again hear his mother's voice. Sally Morrison from the boarding house found him there an hour later, carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. She was a motherly woman in her 50s who'd known Anna well and understood the particular grief of losing a parent. "Thought you might need some food," she said simply, setting the basket beside the grave marker. "Your mother would scold us both if I let you go hungry." "Thank you, Mrs. Morrison." She was proud of you, Josiah. Never stopped talking about her son who worked the mountain railroads. Said you were the bravest man she knew. Sally paused, her own eyes glistening. She wasn't wrong about that. As the days passed, more townspeople approached him with similar kindnesses. The blacksmith offered to repair anything that needed fixing around Anna's house. The merchant at the general store mentioned that Anna's account was settled and he owed her money for sewing work she'd completed. The schoolteacher shared stories of how Anna had helped struggling students learn their letters. Through these conversations, Josiah began to understand the full measure of his mother's life in Millerville. She'd been more than just the railroad worker's mother. She'd been a cornerstone of the community, someone people turned to in times of need. Her death had touched every family in town, and their shared grief became a peculiar form of comfort. But comfort couldn't fill the hollow space where his mother's voice had lived, couldn't ease the weight of choosing work over presence when presence mattered most. As Josiah prepared to close up his mother's house and return to his mountain cabin, he carried with him the knowledge that some regrets were too deep for forgiveness, too permanent for redemption. The mourning dress hanging in the wardrobe would remain there, a black reminder of the goodbye he'd never be able to give. The private train car that arrived in Millerville on November 2nd was unlike anything the frontier town had ever seen. Painted in deep forest green with gold trim, it bore the unmistakable marks of Eastern wealth and refinement. The locomotive that pulled it wore the brass nameplate of the Continental Railroad Company, and when it came to rest beside the rough wooden platform that served as Millerville's station, it might as well have been a visitor from another world. Catherine Ashworth stepped down from the car with the practiced grace of a woman accustomed to being watched. She wore a traveling dress of midnight blue wool, cut in the latest fashion but practical enough for frontier conditions. Her dark hair was arranged beneath a hat that managed to be both stylish and sensible, and her gloved hands moved with the unconscious elegance that marked generations of careful breeding. At 42, Catherine possessed the kind of beauty that came from good bones and careful living. Her face bore the lines of a woman who had experienced both joy and sorrow, but her bearing suggested someone who had never doubted her place in the world. The silk gloves she wore were soft as whispers, dyed a pale cream that perfectly complemented her outfit. They were the hands of a woman who had never known manual labor, never felt the bite of mountain cold without protection. Behind her emerged Harrison Wells, her secretary and travel companion, a thin, nervous man who carried a leather portfolio and wore the harried expression of someone responsible for managing the complicated life of a wealthy widow. He supervised the unloading of several trunks and cases, directing the work with the efficiency of long practice. "Madam," he said, consulting his notes, "the proprietress of the local boarding establishment has been apprised of your arrival. I've taken the liberty of securing the finest accommodations available." Catherine nodded absently, her attention captured by the raw beauty of the mountains that surrounded this small settlement. She'd traveled extensively since her husband's death 3 years ago, but something about this place called to her in a way she couldn't quite explain. Perhaps it was the honesty of the landscape, the way the peaks rose without artifice or pretension toward a sky so blue it seemed painted by divine hand. "Thank you, Harrison. Have our things sent over, and then take some time to rest." The journey was long. The boarding house that served as Millerville's finest accommodation would have been considered rustic by the standards Catherine was accustomed to, but she found its simplicity refreshing. Sally Morrison, the proprietress, greeted her with the kind of straightforward warmth that Catherine had learned to appreciate during her travels through the frontier territories. "Mrs. Ashworth, welcome to Millerville. I've prepared our best room for you, though I hope you'll understand it's not what you might find in Denver or San Francisco. I'm sure it will be perfectly adequate, Mrs. Morrison. I'm here on business, not for luxury." The room was indeed simple, a bed with hand-sewn quilts, a washstand with a china pitcher and bowl, a wardrobe of local pine, and a single window that offered a view of the main street. But it was clean and comfortable, and the absence of gilt and velvet felt oddly liberating after months of staying in hotels that competed to outdo each other in ostentation. Catherine's presence in Millerville was the result of careful planning and considerable research. Since her husband Charles's death, she'd been methodically investing in Western expansion projects, railroads, mining ventures, land development schemes that promised to transform the frontier into something approaching civilization. Her late husband had started the process, but Catherine had discovered an aptitude for business that surprised even her. Charles Ashworth had been a Boston shipping magnate whose wealth came from moving goods between distant ports. His death from pneumonia had left Catherine not only grief-stricken, but also in possession of a fortune that required active management. Rather than retreat into widowhood, as society expected, she'd thrown herself into learning the intricacies of finance and investment with the same determination she'd once applied to hosting dinner parties and managing household staff. Her financial advisor had recommended several promising railroad ventures in the Montana Territory, and Catherine had decided to see the operations firsthand before committing substantial funds. The Continental Railroad's expansion through these mountains represented exactly the kind of infrastructure development that could generate enormous returns for patient investors. But Catherine's journey west had been motivated by more than mere profit. In the 3 years since Charles's death, she'd felt increasingly restless in Boston society. The endless round of social obligations, the carefully scripted conversations about weather and fashion, the way people spoke to her as if widowhood had somehow diminished her intelligence, all of it had begun to feel like a beautifully appointed prison. The West offered something different. Here, she'd discovered, a person's worth was measured by their actions rather than their ancestry. The women she'd met during her travels possessed a strength and independence that both impressed and inspired her. They ran businesses, made decisions, shaped their own destinies in ways that would have scandalized Boston drawing rooms. That evening, Catherine dined in the boarding house's common room, sharing the long table with other guests and residents. The conversation was refreshingly direct talk of weather and crops, railroad schedules and mining claims, the practical concerns of people building lives in challenging circumstances. It was during this meal that she first heard mention of Josiah Crane. "Terrible thing about Anna Crane," said Mr. Patterson, a traveling merchant who'd known the family for years. "Her boy Josiah worked the mountain railroads, you know. Missed her funeral because he was up in the high country laying track. Hardest working man I ever knew," added Tom Bradley, who'd arrived that afternoon from the Devil's Pass project. "Would have been here if he could, but sometimes a man's got to choose between what he wants and what's necessary." Catherine found herself listening with unexpected interest as the conversation continued. The picture that emerged was of a man caught between duty and desire, someone who'd made an impossible choice and would live with the consequences. There was something in the story that resonated with her own experience of loss, her own understanding of how life could force decisions that left permanent scars. "Where is he now?" she asked, surprising herself by joining the conversation. "Back up in his cabin, I expect," Tom replied. "Place is about 15 miles into the mountains. Josiah keeps to himself mostly, but he's good people. His ma raised him right." That night, Catherine lay in her narrow bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a frontier town settling into sleep. Through her window, she could see stars more brilliant than any visible from Boston, scattered across a sky that seemed impossibly vast. She thought about Josiah Crane, this man she'd never met, whose grief had somehow touched her heart. In her carpetbag, she carried letters of credit worth more money than most people would see in a lifetime. She'd come west to invest in railroads and land, to turn her inheritance into an even greater fortune. But lying there in the darkness, Catherine began to wonder if she'd traveled all this way for an entirely different purpose. Catherine's first week in Millerville passed quietly as she conducted her railroad business with the methodical precision that had served her well in Boston's financial circles. She met with local officials, examined survey maps, and interviewed crew foremen about the challenges of mountain construction. The Continental Railroad's Mountain Division impressed her with their competence and determination, and she found herself genuinely interested in the engineering problems they faced. But even as she focused on business matters, she couldn't stop thinking about the mountain man who'd missed his mother's funeral. The story haunted her in ways she didn't fully understand, perhaps because it echoed her own regrets about time lost with Charles during his final illness. She'd been so busy managing social obligations and household affairs that she'd missed precious moments that could never be recovered. It was Father Miguel who provided the details that crystallized her growing resolve. The priest visited the boarding house on Catherine's 4th day in town, having heard that an Eastern lady of some standing was staying there. His manner was gentle and unpretentious, and Catherine found herself drawn into conversation about the community she was temporarily joining. "Mrs. Crane was one of our most devoted parishioners," Father Miguel explained when Catherine carefully steered the conversation toward the Crane family. She never missed Sunday service, and her charity work was legendary. When families fell on hard times, Anna always seemed to know who needed help. "And her son. Josiah is a good man, caught in circumstances beyond his control. The railroad work pays well, but it takes him away for weeks at a time. His mother understood the necessity, even if it broke her heart." Father Miguel paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "I performed the funeral service myself. We waited as long as we could, hoping he might arrive. But October ground freezes quickly up here. The burial couldn't be delayed." Catherine nodded, understanding the practical realities, even as her heart ached for a man she'd never met. Was there a proper service? A suitable resting place? Oh, yes. The entire town attended. Anna was much beloved. "We buried her beside her husband in the church cemetery, with all the dignity befitting a woman of her character." Father Miguel's expression grew thoughtful. "Though I confess, It troubles me that Josiah never had the chance to say goodbye properly. There's healing in ritual, in the formal marking of loss. That evening, Catherine made her decision. She summoned Harrison Wells to her room and instructed him to make discreet inquiries about the cost and logistics of arranging a memorial service. Her secretary, accustomed to his employer's occasionally impulsive generosity, took notes without question, though his eyebrows rose at some of the specifications. "You want me to contact Pemberton and Sons in Denver?" Harrison asked, his pen poised over his notepad. "The same firm that handled Mr. Ashworth's funeral arrangements?" "Indeed, I want their finest mahogany casket with silver handles and silk lining. Something worthy of a woman who raised such a devoted son. Madam, forgive me, but the deceased has already been interred. I'm aware of that, Harrison. This is for a second service, a proper memorial that will allow her son to pay his respects as he should have been able to do originally." Harrison's expression grew more puzzled, but he continued taking dictation. Catherine's instructions were detailed and specific. The casket was to be shipped immediately by special freight, along with professional mourning decorations, memorial programs printed on quality paper, and arrangements for a minister from Denver to officiate if Father Miguel proved unwilling. "And the location, madam? I'm still determining that. Make inquiries about purchasing a suitable plot of land near Mr. Crane's mountain property. Somewhere peaceful, with a good view." The next morning, Catherine began the delicate process of implementing her plan. She started with Father Miguel, approaching him after morning mass with a proposal that clearly surprised the elderly priest. "You wish to arrange a second funeral for Anna Crane?" Father Miguel repeated, as if he might have misheard. "A memorial service," Catherine corrected gently. "Her son deserves the opportunity to say goodbye properly, and the community deserves a chance to honor her memory more fully. I understand you've already provided excellent service, Father, but sometimes circumstances require additional gestures." Father Miguel studied her with eyes that had seen every variety of human motivation. "This is most unusual, Mrs. Ashworth. May I ask what prompts such generosity toward a family you've never met?" Catherine had prepared for this question, though her true motivations remained mysterious even to herself. "I lost my own husband 3 years ago, Father. I understand how important proper farewells can be for those left behind. Consider this my way of honoring both Mrs. Crane's memory and her son's grief." The priest was quiet for a long moment, and Catherine could see him weighing pastoral care against potential scandal. A wealthy Eastern widow arranging elaborate funerals for strangers would certainly provide fodder for gossip. "The expense," he began, "is my concern entirely. I ask only for your blessing and assistance in making the arrangements appropriately respectful." Father Miguel's eventual agreement came with conditions. The service would be simple, despite the expensive trappings, focused on celebration of Anna's life rather than display of wealth. Catherine readily agreed, recognizing wisdom in his approach. The next challenge came from Pemberton and Sons themselves. Mr. Pemberton, reached by telegraph, expressed bewilderment at the unusual request. His firm had handled funerals for senators and railroad barons, but never a second burial for a frontier woman whose son could afford such expenses. "The casket alone will cost more than most people in that territory earn in 5 years, Pemberton explained during their lengthy telegraph exchange. "Are you certain about these specifications?" Catherine was certain. If she was going to honor Anna Crane's memory, she would do it properly, with the kind of dignity that wealth could provide, but that Josiah's honest labor couldn't afford. The mahogany casket would be crafted from trees older than the territory itself, lined with silk, softer than clouds, fitted with handles that would gleam like captured sunlight. Word of Catherine's unusual plan began to spread through Millerville, despite her attempts at discretion. The arrival of telegrams from Denver, combined with Harrison's careful inquiries about land purchases and memorial arrangements, created the kind of mystery that small towns found irresistible. Sally Morrison was the first to approach Catherine directly about the rumors. The boarding house proprietress knocked on Catherine's door one evening, carrying a tea service and wearing an expression of maternal concern. "Mrs. Ashworth, I hope you'll forgive my directness, but people are talking. They say you're planning some kind of funeral for Anna Crane, and I feel obligated to mention that the poor woman is already properly buried." Catherine invited Sally to sit and poured tea with the social grace that had been bred into her bones. "I'm arranging a memorial service, Mrs. Morrison. Mr. Crane deserves the opportunity to honor his mother's memory properly." "That's very kind, but I wonder if you understand how such things might be viewed. We're simple people here, Mrs. Ashworth. Grand gestures from outsiders can create more problems than they solve." The warning was delivered gently, but Catherine heard the concern behind it. She was an outsider, someone whose wealth and social position could easily be seen as condescending rather than generous. The last thing she wanted was to turn her gesture of compassion into a source of community discord. "What would you suggest?" Catherine asked, genuinely seeking guidance. Sally considered her teacup thoughtfully. "If you truly want to help, keep it simple. Let the gesture speak for itself without overwhelming the man you're trying to comfort. Josiah Crane is proud enough to work himself to death rather than accept charity. If your memorial feels like charity, it might do more harm than good." That night, Catherine revised her plans, tempering grand gestures with frontier sensibilities. The mahogany casket would remain. Some things deserved the finest available, but the surrounding ceremony would be simpler, more focused on community and memory than on display of wealth. As she fell asleep to the sound of wind in the pines, Catherine wondered what Josiah Crane would think of a strange woman's efforts to honor his mother's memory. Would he see kindness or condescension? Would her gesture provide comfort or add to his burden of loss? Tomorrow, she would have to decide whether to proceed with her unusual plan or abandon it before the expensive casket arrived from Denver. Either way, she was already more invested in this mountain man's grief than wisdom would have counseled. The mahogany casket arrived on a Tuesday morning, creating more excitement in Millerville than the town had seen since the railroad first came through 5 years earlier. The special freight car that carried it was accompanied by 2 men from Pemberton and Sons, who had traveled from Denver to ensure their finest work received proper handling. When they opened the shipping crate on the station platform, even the most skeptical townspeople fell silent. The casket was a masterpiece of the craftsman's art. Rich mahogany wood, aged and polished to a deep, lustrous finish that seemed to glow from within, formed the body. Silver handles gleamed like captured moonlight, and the interior revealed silk lining of the purest white, soft as a prayer. It was the kind of final resting place reserved for presidents and railroad barons. Yet here it sat in a frontier town, destined for a woman who had lived simply and died quietly. Word spread quickly through the settlement. By noon, a steady stream of curious visitors found reasons to pass by the station, each one wanting to see the magnificent casket with their own eyes. The general consensus was amazement. Nobody had seen anything so fine, so expensive, so clearly crafted for someone of great importance. Josiah Crane first learned of Catherine's plans when Tom Bradley rode up to his mountain cabin that same afternoon. The railroad worker had heard the news in town and felt obligated to warn his friend about the unusual developments. "There's an Eastern lady in town," Tom began without preamble, "and she's arranged some kind of memorial service for your mother." Josiah set down the axe he'd been using to split firewood and studied his visitor's face. "What kind of memorial service?" "The expensive kind, mahogany, a casket from Denver, the works. Nobody knows why she's doing it, but the whole town's talking." The information hit Josiah like a physical blow. He'd been living with his grief in solitude, working through his guilt and sorrow in the privacy of his mountain retreat. The idea that a stranger, a wealthy stranger, had decided to involve herself in his most private pain felt like an invasion. "Who is she?" "Name's Catherine Ashworth, widow from back east, here on railroad business. Rich as Solomon, from what I hear. She's staying at Sally's place." Josiah walked to the edge of his porch and looked down toward the valley where Millerville lay hidden among the trees. His mother's simple grave was down there, in the church cemetery where she belonged. The idea of someone else, someone who'd never known Anna Crane, presuming to arrange elaborate ceremonies, felt wrong in ways he couldn't articulate. Did she know my mother? Never met her. That's what has people puzzled. Sally Morrison says the lady heard your story and decided to help, but nobody understands why. That evening, Josiah sat at his rough-hewn table and carefully carved a headstone for his mother's grave. He'd been working on it since returning from the mountains, shaping a piece of local pine into something that would properly mark her resting place. The wood was humble, but every cut was made with love, every letter carved with the precision of deep feeling. He'd inscribed her name, the years of her birth and death, and below that, a simple phrase, "Beloved mother and friend." It wasn't elaborate, but it came from his heart, the heart of a son who'd learned too late the true cost of absence. As he worked, sanding the letters smooth and treating the wood to withstand mountain weather, Josiah tried to understand why this stranger would involve herself in his family's affairs. Was it pity? Some kind of wealthy person's game? The idea that his mother's memory had become entertainment for someone with too much money and too little sense made his jaw clench with suppressed anger. Meanwhile, in town, Catherine faced growing criticism for her unusual project. The arrival of the expensive casket had crystallized opposition that had been building since word of her plans first spread. A delegation of prominent townspeople, led by Mr. Hendricks from the general store and Mrs. Patterson from the church auxiliary, visited her at the boarding house to express their concerns. Mrs. Ashworth, Mr. Hendricks began diplomatically, "We appreciate your generous intentions, but some of us worry that this memorial might cause more harm than good." Catherine received them in the boarding house's small parlor, serving tea with the grace that had been drummed into her since childhood. "I'm listening to your concerns, Mr. Hendricks. It's the expense, you see. That casket cost more than most families here make in years. It makes Anna's original burial look poor by comparison, and that reflects badly on all of us who participated." Mrs. Patterson nodded in agreement. "Anna was one of us." Mrs. Ashworth, "Simple people who take care of our own. Your grand gesture makes it seem like what we provided wasn't good enough." Catherine hadn't considered this perspective, and the realization troubled her. "I meant no disrespect to the community's efforts. I simply wanted to honor Mrs. Crane's memory properly." "But whose definition of properly are we using?" asked Dr. Richardson, who had joined the delegation. "Anna lived modestly and died peacefully. She wouldn't have wanted elaborate displays or expensive ceremonies. She would have wanted her son to heal from his grief and move forward with his life." The doctor's words carried particular weight because of his relationship with the Crane family. Catherine found herself reconsidering not just the details of her plan, but the wisdom of the entire enterprise. "What would you have me do? The casket is already here. The arrangements are made." "Talk to Josiah," Dr. Richardson suggested. "Before you go any further, talk to the man you're trying to help. Find out if he wants your assistance." That night, Catherine couldn't sleep. She stood at her window, looking up at the mountains where Josiah Crane lived with his grief and his hand-carved memorial. The mahogany casket sat in the freight office like an expensive reproach to her good intentions, beautiful and meaningful to no one but herself. She'd come west seeking purpose, drawn by stories of frontier independence and genuine achievement. Instead, she found herself accused of the same kind of thoughtless charity that she'd criticized in Boston society, grand gestures that served the giver's conscience more than the recipient's needs. Harrison Wells found her in the parlor the next morning, staring out at the mountains with her untouched breakfast growing cold beside her. "Madam, the memorial arrangements are proceeding as planned. Father Miguel has agreed to officiate, and the cemetery plot has been secured. Shall I confirm the date?" Catherine turned from the window, her decision crystallizing as she spoke. "First, Harrison, I need you to arrange a meeting. There's someone I must speak with before we proceed." "Of course, madam. Who would you like me to contact?" "Mr. Josiah Crane. If I'm going to honor his mother's memory, I should at least have the courtesy to ask his permission." The simple wooden headstone Josiah was carving would never compete with elaborate monuments or expensive ceremonies. But it carried something the mahogany casket lacked: the weight of genuine love, the authority of a son's devotion, the simple truth of grief honestly expressed. As Catherine prepared to climb into the mountains to meet the man whose sorrow had captured her imagination, she wondered if her grand gesture could ever match the power of such humble sincerity. The journey to Josiah Crane's mountain cabin required Catherine to hire a guide and travel by horseback along trails that challenged even experienced riders. She'd insisted on making the trip herself, despite Harrison's protests about the dangers and impropriety of a woman of her station venturing into such remote territory. Something about this meeting felt too important to delegate. Her guide was Pete Morrison, the young railroad worker who'd carried the telegram that shattered Josiah's world. Pete knew the mountain trails well and understood the gravity of Catherine's mission, though he remained skeptical about its wisdom. "Josiah's not much for visitors," Pete warned, as they navigated a particularly treacherous section of trail. "He's been keeping to himself since his ma died. Might not take kindly to strangers showing up unannounced." Catherine adjusted her position in the unfamiliar saddle, grateful for the practical riding clothes she'd purchased in Denver. "I understand his need for privacy, but this conversation is necessary. I won't proceed with my plans without his consent." The cabin, when they finally reached it, exceeded Catherine's expectations. She'd imagined something crude and temporary, but Josiah's home revealed the work of a man who built things to last. The logs were perfectly fitted, the roof sound and weatherproof, the entire structure harmonizing with the natural landscape as if it had grown from the mountain itself. Josiah emerged from the cabin as they approached, his hand resting on the handle of an axe stuck in a chopping block. He was taller than Catherine had expected, with the kind of lean strength that came from years of physical labor. His dark hair showed premature gray at the temples, and his eyes held the wary intelligence of a man accustomed to solitude. "Mr. Crane," Pete called out, "I've brought someone to see you. This is Mrs. Catherine Ashworth from back east." Josiah's gaze moved from Pete to Catherine, taking in her expensive riding clothes and obvious Eastern refinement. His expression remained carefully neutral, but Catherine sensed the tension beneath his polite facade. "Ma'am," he said simply, touching his hat brim in acknowledgement. Catherine dismounted with Pete's assistance, feeling suddenly uncertain now that she faced the man whose grief had prompted her unusual intervention. "Mr. Crane, I apologize for the intrusion. I know you value your privacy, but I felt we needed to speak before I proceeded with certain arrangements. The memorial service, it wasn't a question. Yes, I wanted to explain my intentions and seek your permission before continuing." Josiah studied her for a long moment, and Catherine felt as if she were being weighed and measured by someone who'd learned to read character in the set of a person's shoulders. The steadiness of their gaze. "Pete, you can water the horses and rest for a spell," Josiah said finally. "Mrs. Ashworth and I have some talking to do." He led her to the cabin's porch, where 2 chairs sat overlooking the valley below. The view was breathtaking, endless peaks and forests stretching to the horizon, painted in the gold and amber of late afternoon light. Catherine understood why a man might choose this solitude over the complications of civilization. "I suppose you want to know why," Catherine began, settling into the offered chair. The thought had occurred to me. Catherine had rehearsed various explanations during the long ride up the mountain, but sitting here in the presence of Josiah's quiet dignity, her prepared speeches seemed inadequate. Instead, she found herself speaking from her heart. "I lost my husband 3 years ago. I was so busy with social obligations and household management that I missed precious time with him during his final illness. When I heard your story, I recognized something of my own regret. Josiah nodded slowly. I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am, but that doesn't explain why you'd go to such expense for strangers. Perhaps because we're not really strangers. Catherine paused, gathering courage for what she had to tell him. Mr. Crane, there's something you should know about my late husband's business interests. She opened her traveling bag and withdrew a leather portfolio from which she extracted several documents. Charles Ashworth was heavily invested in railroad development throughout the West. When he died, I inherited not just his fortune, but his business correspondence and investment records. Josiah's expression grew more attentive as Catherine spread papers on the small table between their chairs. 3 months ago, while reviewing his files, I discovered that Charles had been the primary financier for several mountain railroad projects, including the Devil's Pass line where you were working when your mother died. The revelation hit Josiah like a physical blow. He leaned forward, studying the documents Catherine had laid out, contracts, payment schedules, progress reports that bore his own name among the crew listings. Your husband financed the job that kept me away from my mother's deathbed. Yes, Catherine's voice was barely above a whisper, but there's more. Charles died while that project was in progress. According to his correspondence, he'd been following the work closely, particularly impressed by reports about a crew leader named Josiah Crane. She handed him a letter written in her husband's careful script. Charles wrote this to his business partner 2 weeks before he died. He specifically mentioned you by name, praising your dedication and work ethic. He called you exactly the kind of man who's building the future of this territory. Josiah read the letter twice, his hands trembling slightly as he absorbed its contents. Charles Ashworth had not only financed the project that kept him from his mother's side, but had apparently taken personal interest in Josiah's contributions to the work. I don't understand, Josiah said finally. What does this change? Catherine removed her wedding ring, a simple gold band that had never left her finger since Charles placed it there 15 years ago. She set it on the table beside her husband's letter, the late afternoon sun making the gold gleam like captured fire. It changes everything, she said softly. Charles believed in the railroad project because he believed it would improve people's lives, bring prosperity to communities like Millerville. But he died before seeing the human cost of that progress, before knowing that his investment required a good man to choose between work and family. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the whisper of wind through the pines. Josiah stared at the documents, trying to process the revelation that his private grief was connected to this woman's loss in ways he'd never imagined. The memorial service, he said slowly, it's not charity. No, it's restitution. Charles would have been devastated to know that his business decisions contributed to your absence during your mother's final days. I can't undo that choice. But I can ensure that Anna Crane receives the honor she deserved, the honor that circumstances prevented you from providing. Catherine gathered the papers and placed them back in her portfolio, leaving only the wedding ring on the table between them. I'm not asking you to forgive my husband for something he couldn't have foreseen. I'm asking you to let me honor your mother's memory as a way of honoring the sacrifice that her son made for Charles's vision of progress. The revelation reframed everything Josiah thought he understood about the wealthy widow's intervention. This wasn't the whim of a bored socialite seeking to ease her conscience through grand gestures. This was a woman trying to balance scales that fate had tipped toward tragedy. The casket from Denver, Josiah said, is the finest craftsmanship available, worthy of a woman who raised a son Charles Ashworth considered exemplary. Catherine stood, preparing to leave him with this new understanding. The choice is yours, Mr. Crane. If you'd prefer to keep your grief private, I'll respect that decision. But if you'll allow it, I'd like to help you say goodbye to your mother properly. As Pete prepared their horses for the return journey, Catherine left Josiah sitting on his porch, surrounded by the documents that connected their separate tragedies. Her wedding ring remained on his table, a symbol of her willingness to let go of the past in service of healing the present. The ride back to Millerville passed in contemplative silence, both Catherine and Pete understanding that they'd witnessed something profound, the moment when two strangers discovered that fate had woven their stories together long before they'd ever met. Whether that discovery would lead to healing or deepen existing wounds remained to be seen. Josiah sat on his porch until the stars emerged, Catherine's wedding ring catching moonlight like a tiny beacon on the rough wooden table. The documents she'd left told a story he'd never imagined, how his private grief was connected to a stranger's investment portfolio, how his mother's death had been shaped by decisions made in Boston drawing rooms he'd never see. The revelation should have brought anger, but instead he felt something closer to wonder. Charles Ashworth had been a real person, not just a name on corporate papers. He'd followed the Devil's Pass project closely, had apparently taken pride in the crew's progress, had spoken of Josiah by name in letters to business partners. The work that kept him from his mother's deathbed had mattered to someone, had been part of a larger vision that transcended mere profit. 3 days passed before Josiah made his decision. He spent the time walking the mountain trails, thinking through the implications of Catherine's offer, weighing his pride against his mother's memory. On the 4th morning, he saddled his horse and rode down to Millerville, carrying Catherine's ring in his shirt pocket and his hand-carved headstone wrapped carefully in canvas. He found Catherine in the boarding house dining room, sharing breakfast with Father Miguel and Dr. Richardson. The conversation ceased when he appeared in the doorway, 3 pairs of eyes studying his face for signs of his decision. "Mrs. Ashworth," he said, removing his hat, "might I have a word?" Catherine rose gracefully, her expression carefully neutral. "Of course, Mr. Crane. Perhaps we could speak privately?" They walked to the boarding house's small garden, where Sally Morrison grew vegetables and herbs behind a picket fence that needed painting. The morning air carried the scent of dying flowers and the promise of winter, reminding both of them that time was precious and opportunities finite. "I brought your ring back," Josiah said, offering her the simple gold band. "You've decided against the memorial service." Catherine's voice held disappointment but not surprise. "No, ma'am. I've decided to accept your offer." He watched her face change as the words registered. "But with conditions." Catherine nodded, encouraging him to continue. "The service will be on my property, where my mother can rest with a view of the mountains she loved. Father Miguel will officiate, and the ceremony will be simple, no grand speeches or elaborate rituals. Just a chance for folks to pay their respects properly. Those seem like reasonable conditions." "There's more." Josiah unwrapped the wooden headstone he'd been carving. "This stays with her, alongside whatever marker you provide. My mother deserves to be remembered by her son's hands, as well as your husband's fortune." Catherine examined the headstone, running her fingers over the carefully carved letters. The wood was smooth as silk, each character formed with obvious love and painstaking attention to detail. "Beloved mother and friend," read more eloquently than any elaborate epitaph could have managed. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "She would have treasured it." "You don't know what she would have treasured." The words came out sharper than Josiah intended, and he saw Catherine flinch at the rebuke. But instead of taking offense, she nodded in acknowledgement. "You're right. I never knew your mother, and I should remember that. I'm honoring my husband's memory as much as hers, perhaps more." The honesty in her admission softened something in Josiah's expression. "Why did you keep your husband's ring all this time?" Catherine looked down at the simple band in her palm. "Because taking it off felt like abandoning him completely. As long as I wore it, part of our marriage continued. And now I think Charles would want me to use our shared resources to help rather than hide behind them." She slipped the ring into her reticule with a gesture that seemed final. "When should we hold the service?" "Sunday afternoon. Gives folks time to prepare without interfering with regular church services." Over the next 3 days, Millerville transformed as word of the memorial service spread. Catherine's revelation about her husband's connection to the railroad project had leaked out, changing the community's perception of her unusual gesture. What had seemed like wealthy condescension now appeared as an attempt to balance moral accounts, and public opinion shifted accordingly. Sally Morrison proved instrumental in organizing the community response. She coordinated food preparations, arranged transportation for elderly residents who wanted to attend, and gently managed the social dynamics that such an unusual event might create. Anna would have loved this, she told Catherine, as they planned the reception that would follow the service. Not the expense or the attention, but the way it's bringing people together. That's what she cared about: community, connection, people looking after each other. The mahogany casket was transported to Josiah's property on Saturday morning, carried by 6 men from the railroad crew who had worked with him and respected his character. Tom Bradley supervised the work, ensuring that Pemberton and Sons' masterpiece received the careful handling it deserved. Dr. Richardson had suggested that the casket remain empty, a symbolic gesture rather than an actual reburial. Anna's body would rest peacefully in the church cemetery, but her memorial service could provide the closure that circumstances had denied her son. Catherine arrived at Josiah's cabin early Sunday morning, bringing with her a selection of memorial programs printed on quality paper. Each program featured Anna's name and dates, a brief biography highlighting her community service, and a verse from scripture that Father Miguel had suggested. She opens her hand to the poor and reaches out her hands to the needy. "It's perfect," Josiah said, reading the program. She would have liked that verse. Father Miguel said it was her favorite. She quoted it often when organizing help for struggling families. They worked together through the morning, arranging chairs borrowed from the church, setting up tables for the reception, and preparing the site where the casket would rest during the ceremony. The mahogany gleamed in the mountain's sunlight, its silver handles reflecting the surrounding peaks like mirrors. "It's more beautiful than I imagined," Josiah admitted, studying the casket's craftsmanship. Charles always believed that important moments deserved appropriate settings. He would have approved of honoring your mother this way. By noon, people began arriving. They came on foot, on horseback, and in wagons, families from Millerville and the surrounding areas who had known Anna Crane and respected her son. The railroad crew arrived together, led by Foreman Murphy, who had traveled down from the high country specifically for the service. Pete Morrison brought his entire family, including his brother, Eddie, whose leg had healed well after Josiah's rescue in the ravine. The school teacher came with several former students who remembered Anna's help with their lessons. Even Mr. Hendricks from the general store attended, despite his earlier criticism of Catherine's plans. As the crowd gathered around the simple gravesite Josiah had prepared, Catherine felt a profound sense of rightness about her decision. This wasn't about grand gestures or social positioning. This was about a community coming together to honor one of their own, made possible by resources that could finally serve a worthy purpose. Father Miguel arrived carrying his worn Bible and wearing the serious expression he reserved for life's most solemn moments. He shook hands with Josiah, nodded respectfully to Catherine, and surveyed the assembled crowd with satisfaction. Anna would have been amazed by this turnout, he told Josiah. She never fully understood how much she meant to this community. The service began at 2 o'clock, with Father Miguel's clear voice carrying across the mountain, clearing as he spoke about love, loss, and the connections that bind communities together. Catherine stood beside Josiah throughout the ceremony, no longer the wealthy outsider arranging charity for strangers, but a woman who had found her own path to healing through service to others. The mahogany casket sat empty, but somehow full of meaning, a symbol of how fate could connect the most unlikely people in the most unexpected ways. As the afternoon sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and amber, Anna Crane received the farewell her son had been denied the chance to give, surrounded by the love of a community that would never forget her quiet grace. Father Miguel's voice carried across the mountain, clearing with the authority of long practice and deep faith. "We gather today not in sorrow, but in celebration of a life well lived." Anna Crane embodied the virtues that build strong communities: kindness, generosity, and unwavering faith in the goodness of human nature. Josiah stood beside the empty mahogany casket, his hand resting on the smooth wood as if drawing strength from its presence. The crowd had grown larger than anyone expected, nearly the entire population of Millerville, along with railroad workers who had traveled from distant camps to pay their respects. Their faces reflected the genuine affection that Anna had inspired through years of quiet service. Anna never sought recognition for her acts of charity, Father Miguel continued. She simply saw need and responded, whether it was a meal for a sick neighbor, help with a difficult lesson, or comfort for a grieving friend. Her legacy lives not in monuments of stone, but in the lives she touched. Catherine found herself deeply moved by the simple eloquence of the service. This was nothing like the formal Episcopal ceremonies she'd attended in Boston, where ritual often overshadowed meaning. Here, every word felt personal, every gesture authentic. As Father Miguel spoke about Anna's devotion to her son, Josiah's composure finally cracked. 3 weeks of suppressed grief broke free in a sob that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. Catherine, standing beside him, felt his anguish as if it were her own. Without thinking, she reached out and took his hand, offering what comfort she could to a man she was only beginning to know. "Let us pray for Anna's eternal rest," Father Miguel said, "and for healing for those who mourn her passing." During the prayer, Sally Morrison approached the casket, carrying something wrapped in faded cloth. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing an old Bible, leather-bound, worn soft from decades of use, its pages yellowed with age. This was Anna's personal Bible, the one she'd read every morning and evening for as long as anyone could remember. "I found this among Anna's things," Sally said quietly to Josiah. "Doc Richardson asked me to bring it today. He said, there was something inside you needed to see." Josiah opened the Bible with trembling hands. Between the pages, pressed like flowers, were dozens of small mementos, letters from Josiah during his railroad trips, pressed wildflowers from mountain meadows, small tokens of a life lived simply but richly. And tucked into the back cover, he found something that stopped his heart: a collection of newspaper clippings about railroad construction projects, each one carefully saved because it mentioned his name or the crews he worked with. "She was proud of you," Sally whispered. "So proud that she saved every mention of your work, every sign that others recognized your worth." But it was the final item that broke him completely, a letter in his mother's handwriting, addressed to him but never sent. The paper was newer than the other items, dated just a week before her death. With shaking hands, Josiah unfolded it and read, "My dearest son, I know you worry about leaving me for the railroad work, but I want you to understand that I am proud of the man you've become. Your father would be proud too. You work to provide for our family, to build something lasting in this territory. That work matters, Josiah, even when it requires sacrifice. If God calls me home while you're away, know that I understand your absence and forgive it completely. You are a good son, and nothing, not distance, not time, not even death, can change my love for you. Live without guilt, my boy. Live with the knowledge that your mother's heart is at peace. All my love, Anna." The letter fluttered in Josiah's hands as he read it aloud, his voice breaking on nearly every word. By the time he finished, there wasn't a dry eye among the assembled mourners. Even the hardened railroad men wiped away tears, moved by the depth of a mother's love and understanding. Catherine felt her own tears falling freely as she listened to Anna's final message to her son. This woman she'd never met had possessed a wisdom and grace that put her own struggles into perspective. Anna had understood that love sometimes required letting go, that duty could conflict with desire without diminishing either. "She knew," Josiah whispered, clutching the letter to his chest. "She knew why I had to go, and she forgave me." Father Miguel allowed the emotion of the moment to settle before speaking again. Anna Crane's final gift to her son was the gift of forgiveness, not because he needed forgiveness, but because she wanted him to be free from guilt. She understood that love sometimes requires difficult choices, and that understanding itself is a form of love. The ceremony continued, with shared memories from community members who had known Anna well. Each story revealed another facet of her character: her generosity with struggling families, her patience with difficult children, her quiet strength during hard times. Through these memories, Catherine began to understand the full measure of the woman whose memorial service had brought them all together. As the formal service concluded and people began to move toward the reception area, Josiah remained beside the casket, still holding his mother's letter and her worn Bible. Catherine stayed with him, understanding that some moments required witness rather than words. In the afternoon light, with the mountains rising around them like cathedral walls, Mother's final message had finally reached her son. The reception that followed the memorial service took place on Josiah's porch and in the clearing around his cabin. Tables borrowed from the church groaned under the weight of food that the community had prepared: fresh bread, preserves, roasted meats, and pies that filled the mountain air with the sense of home and comfort. People who had driven long distances to attend seemed reluctant to leave, as if Anna's memory had created a temporary sanctuary in the wilderness. Catherine found herself genuinely welcomed into conversations she would never have imagined joining a month ago. Mrs. Patterson shared stories about Anna's sewing circle, while Tom Bradley and the railroad crew explained how Josiah's reputation for integrity had spread throughout the mountain construction camps. She was no longer the wealthy outsider arranging charity, but simply another mourner honoring a good woman's memory. "Your husband's investments helped build something important up here," Foreman Murphy told her as they watched Josiah accept condolences from a steady stream of visitors. "That Devil's Pass line will bring prosperity to communities that never had much hope before." Anna understood that, even if it cost her time with her son. Dr. Richardson approached, carrying a small wooden box that he presented to Josiah with ceremony. "Your mother asked me to give this to you when the time was right. I think today qualifies." Inside the box, Josiah found a pair of train tickets his mother had purchased for a trip to San Francisco that she'd planned to take with him once the railroad work slowed down. The tickets were dated for the spring of 1884, a future that would never arrive, but which represented Anna's faith that better times lay ahead. She was saving money for months to buy those. "Dr. Richardson explained, wanted to see the ocean before she died, and she wanted to see it with you. She said the railroad would make such trips possible for ordinary folk like yourselves." Catherine studied the train tickets, simple pieces of paper that represented dreams deferred and love postponed. They reminded her of her own unused tickets, the trips she and Charles had planned but never taken because business always seemed to interfere. The parallels between her story and Josiah's struck her with renewed force. "She believed in the future you were helping to build," Catherine told Josiah, "even when that future required sacrifice from both of you." As the afternoon wore on, people began to share more personal memories of Anna. The schoolteacher told of how Anna had stayed after hours to help struggling students, never accepting payment for her time. Sally Morrison described Anna's involvement in organizing relief for families hit by mining accidents or crop failures. Each story painted the portrait of a woman who had lived fully despite her modest circumstances. It was young Pete Morrison who provided the moment that would stay with everyone present. The shy railroad worker stood up during a lull in conversation and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Crane saved my family when I was 12, he said, his face flushed with emotion. "My pa was hurt in a mine accident, couldn't work for months. We were down to eating bark soup when Mrs. Crane showed up with a basket of food. Came every week until pa got back on his feet. Never asked for nothing in return." Pete paused, struggling with the weight of memory. "She told my ma that neighbors look after neighbors, and that someday we'd have the chance to help someone else the same way. Said that's how communities get built, one act of kindness at a time." The story resonated with others, who began sharing their own experiences of Anna's quiet generosity. A pattern emerged of a woman who had somehow found ways to help despite having little herself, who had strengthened the entire community through individual acts of compassion. Catherine listened with growing amazement and something approaching humility. Her expensive casket and elaborate arrangements seemed suddenly small beside the monument of good works that Anna had built through simple daily choices. This woman had created a legacy without wealth, without recognition, without any of the advantages that Catherine had taken for granted. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the clearing, Catherine made a decision that surprised even herself. She stood and addressed the assembled crowd, her voice carrying the authority of her social position, but tempered by genuine emotion. "I came to Montana to honor Mrs. Crane's memory," she said, "but I've learned that her true memorial already exists in the lives she touched and the community she helped build. Rather than simply funding today's service, I'd like to establish something permanent, a fund that will continue Anna Crane's work of helping families in need." The announcement created a stir of excitement and gratitude. Catherine continued, outlining her vision for a charitable foundation that would provide assistance to families facing medical emergencies, job losses, or other crises that could devastate frontier households. Mrs. Crane understood that communities thrive when members support each other, Catherine concluded. This fund will ensure that her example of compassion continues to benefit people long after today's memories fade. Josiah approached her as the crowd dispersed into the gathering dusk. "You didn't need to do that." "Yes, I did," Catherine replied, studying the train tickets he still held. "Your mother believed in building something lasting. So do I." The 2 tickets to San Francisco gleamed in the lamplight, like promises of journeys that might still be possible, dreams that could be honored even if their original form had become impossible. As the last guests departed and quiet settled over the mountain clearing, both Catherine and Josiah understood that the day had changed them in ways they were only beginning to comprehend. Spring arrived early in the Montana Territory that year, melting the snow from the high peaks and filling the mountain streams with water that sang of renewal and possibility. Catherine had extended her stay in Millerville through the winter months, ostensibly to oversee the establishment of the Anna Crane Memorial Fund, but increasingly because she found herself reluctant to return to the life she'd left behind in Boston. The fund had become everything she'd envisioned, and more. With careful management and the support of local leaders, it had already assisted 6 families through various crises, medical expenses, job injuries, and the kind of unexpected hardships that could devastate frontier households. Dr. Richardson served as the fund's medical advisor, while Father Miguel helped identify families in need. The work gave Catherine a sense of purpose she'd never found in Boston society gatherings. More surprising than the fund's success was the friendship that had developed between Catherine and Josiah. Their shared connection through the railroad project and Anna's memorial had evolved into something deeper, a recognition of kindred spirits who had both learned hard lessons about love, loss, and the choices that define a life. Josiah had taken to visiting Catherine in town several times a week, ostensibly to discuss fund business, but increasingly for the simple pleasure of her company. Their conversations ranged from practical matters to philosophical discussions about community, progress, and the role of individual responsibility in building something larger than oneself. "Your mother would have loved seeing what her memorial accomplished," Catherine told him during one of their afternoon walks through Millerville's main street. The town had grown noticeably during her stay, with new businesses and families attracted by the railroad connections that Charles's investments had helped make possible. "She would have been amazed that her story reached so far," Josiah replied. "Ma always thought her influence ended at the church cemetery." They paused outside the general store, where a new sign advertised, "Fresh goods weekly via Continental Railroad." The transformation of the frontier was visible everywhere: better supplies, faster communication, opportunities that hadn't existed even a year earlier. Catherine understood now how Charles had envisioned progress, how individual sacrifices could contribute to collective advancement. The Figand, Anna Crane Memorial Fund, had established its headquarters in a small building next to the church, where Catherine spent most of her working hours. She'd discovered an aptitude for the practical aspects of charity work, evaluating needs, managing resources, coordinating volunteers. The work engaged her intelligence in ways that Boston's social obligations never had. On this particular spring afternoon, she was reviewing applications for assistance when Josiah arrived, carrying something wrapped in soft cloth. His expression combined nervousness with determination, as if he'd reached a decision that both excited and terrified him. "I brought you something," he said, setting the bundle on her desk. "It's not much, but I wanted you to have it." Catherine unwrapped the cloth to reveal a quilt unlike anything she'd ever seen. The pattern was complex and beautiful, composed of fabric squares that seemed to tell a story. As she examined it more closely, she realized that the squares had been cut from dresses, some familiar, some not. "The blue fabric is from my mother's Sunday dress," Josiah explained. "The green is from her everyday work dress. The white squares come from her wedding dress, which she kept in a trunk for 40 years. Catherine's fingers traced the careful stitching that joined the squares. "It's beautiful, Josiah, but these are precious family memories. I couldn't—" "The other squares are from your traveling dresses," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "Sally Morrison helped me collect fabric samples during the winter. She said it was proper for a quilt to represent both families when they're joining together." The words hung in the spring air like a question waiting for an answer. Catherine looked up from the quilt to find Josiah watching her with an expression she'd never seen before: hope tempered by vulnerability, love offered without guarantees. "Joining together? I know it seems sudden, and I know we come from different worlds," Josiah said, the words tumbling out as if he'd rehearsed them countless times. "But this winter taught me that some connections run deeper than circumstances. You understand loss the way I do. You care about building something lasting, and you loved my mother's memory enough to honor it properly." Catherine set the quilt aside and moved to the window that overlooked the church cemetery. She could see Anna's grave from here, marked now by both Josiah's hand-carved headstone and a modest granite marker funded by the memorial service. The two monuments stood side by side, representing different approaches to the same love. "I've been thinking about those train tickets," she said softly, "the ones your mother saved for the trip to San Francisco. What about them? They represent dreams deferred but not abandoned. Maybe it's not too late for some journeys." She turned back to face him, and Josiah saw his answer in her smile before she spoke it aloud. "I'd be honored to accept your proposal, if you're sure about taking on a stubborn Eastern widow with more money than sense. I'm sure about taking on a woman with the heart to honor a stranger's grief and the wisdom to turn it into something lasting." They were married a month later in a ceremony that brought together the entire community. Father Miguel officiated, Sally Morrison organized the reception, and the railroad crew served as Josiah's groomsmen. Catherine wore a simple dress appropriate for frontier life, and the quilt served as their wedding blanket, a symbol of two lives and two histories woven together into something stronger than either could have achieved alone. The Anna Crane Memorial Fund continued to grow under their joint management, eventually expanding to serve multiple communities throughout the territory. The work kept them connected to the values that had brought them together: service, compassion, and the understanding that individual choices could contribute to collective progress. Years later, when grandchildren asked about their unlikely romance, Catherine and Josiah would tell them about a photograph, a railroad job, and the way grief could sometimes lead to grace. They'd speak of how love could emerge from loss, how strangers could become family, and how the memory of a good woman could inspire others to build something lasting in her honor. The quilt remained with them always, a reminder that the strongest bonds are often forged from the fabric of shared sorrow and mutual understanding, stitched together with threads of hope and the patient work of healing hearts.